Okay, so in this video, we're going to begin our discussion of client management, specifically how to keep your clients happy, how to make sure you get them the results that they truly want. Now remember, at this stage in the game, they have read your irresistible intrigue offer. They're clearly fairly well indoctrinated to you because they have become your clients, and you've already started, excuse me, you've already started building some momentum from your initial intake call. So if you remembered our discussion of how to do the intake call, whether or not you use my process or Thor's process or a hybrid of the two, typically during that intake call, you're already going to gain a fairly good amount of momentum by coming up with a plan of action with your client in a collaborative environment. So you've already got a fairly good game plan, a plan of attack. So what I like to do is after they've agreed to become a client, I'll give them some homework to keep that momentum going, and then I'll immediately want to have Gerald schedule our first session together. And typically our first session together is a little bit longer than the normal session. I might make it an hour or so. I'm not really too big of a stickler on time with that. And the purpose of that very first session is to really get a 90-day game plan set in place for the client. If we try to get like a 12-month game plan or so forth, it's usually too long, and I found it easier to chunk it down into at least a quarterly plan of attack. So we'll have a quarterly mission, and then of course we'll divide all of those tasks down into smaller missions, usually things that we want to accomplish every other week in my case, or as your case may differ depending on how often you decide to speak with your clients. But before we get into any of that, there's something you need to understand. First thing we got to do is really understand your role as a consultant. It's interesting, and I'd heard this before, but it never really sank in until I started doing this. It's interesting that people will basically engage you for different reasons. Number one is obviously they want you to be an actual advisor to them and help them in their business. Another thing can be just someone to hold them accountable. I've had multiple clients who really all they want is for me to say, okay, man, did you do that? Now, we said you were going to do that. I know you're busy, but you promised me you would do that. And they told me flat out, hey, this is really what I want you to do. Okay, whatever. Sometimes they'll want you to be a bad cop, and that is they'll want you to be the outside force whose word and law is irrefutable to other members of their team. This is an interesting scenario, but it can, and in my case certainly has occurred, where your client will have other people involved in the business who might have some input, and you are used kind of as leverage to help get ideas and plans and processes pushed through the system. They will literally say, well, you know, we've got this consultant, and the consultant said to do this, and we're paying this money, so here's what we're going to do. And the client will know damn well that that's what they need to do anyway, but they sort of use you as that bad cop leverage to get the plan pushed through. So interestingly enough, that's one reason people will bring you on board. Interestingly and strangely enough, is another reason that people will retain you is that they want you as a sounding board, or rather a confidant, I'm sorry. I have actually had, kid you not, I've had on multiple occasions several sessions and several prolonged engagements with clients where we rarely talk about the business at all. It's usually personal matters ranging from marital issues to health issues to social issues, etc. So sometimes they just want someone to hang out with, and they want to have a like-minded person to sort of talk to, which I know sounds very strange potentially to you or I. However, whatever the client wants is okay with me, so long as they're getting the results that they're truly after. And finally, I said this earlier, I got my little PowerPoint mixed up here. The final thing that they might want is a sounding board. Someone to literally say, yep, that sounds about right, good job. I've had this occur also, where initially the client came on and there was a certain issue that we needed to address, which is simply just making more money. Strangely enough, we were able to double this client's business in about 90 days just by expansion of media, acquiring more traffic, and tweaking the follow-up system to be a little more effective. And after we did that, the rest of our relationship was me pretty much being a sounding board for this client, where they would say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. I'd say, you know what, I think that's a pretty good idea. Well done. Good job. So sometimes your job will be to hold out or to hand out the gold star by their name, metaphorically speaking. It's very important to really understand that we should never push our values onto the client. For example, I would never pay someone to be a confidant in a business environment. I would never want to hire someone and spend a lot of money with them to talk about social matters or family issues or my personal health, unless, of course, I were hiring them for advice and counsel in those specific areas. But just because that would not equal my value does not mean that if that's what they want, I should deprive them of that, and nor should you. Same with a sounding board or an accountability partner. I'm always very, very ROI focused, very mission and goal oriented. Therefore, everything other than actual advisor would be a waste of time for me if I were hiring a consultant. However, just because my value is primarily gotten from that first category of actual advisor does not mean that I should push that value onto my client. If they're after an accountability partner, then that's what I should give them. And I tell you this to let you know up front that, and for all I know, you're already consulting, so you've experienced this, but you need to understand that your clients will often have different values than you will. And when I say values, I don't mean ethical and moral values. I mean the way they value your relationship. They will want something that is valuable to them which you would not perceive as valuable to you. My suggestion to you is be okay with whatever it is they want, assuming, of course, it's productive, etc., and deliver that to them. So, how do we really find out how to be productive? How to really get them the results that they're after? This is some stuff that I like to do in our very first session. And I use this first session to lay the groundwork for our 90-day plan. So the first thing I like to do is really elicit the client's values by asking them questions, just like I like to do during the conversion conversation. So what I'll say is I'll open up the conversation, our first session together, typically with some pleasantries. Hey man, how's it going? I'll ask them if they got the stuff done that we had discussed initially on our intake call. There's usually about a 30% chance of that actually occurring, strangely enough, and that's okay with me. Then I'll ask this question. I'll say, listen, what's the most important thing that we can accomplish together over the next 90 days? And sometimes I will add a because after that. So I'll say, what's the most important thing we can accomplish together over the next 90 days? Because I found that chunking everything down into 90-day segments is the most productive way for us to work. So what's the most important thing that we can accomplish together over the next 90 days? And then they'll answer. And whatever, excuse me, whatever they say is okay with me, right? Unless it's something weird, like, well, I want to accomplish a head transplant or something. That would be a little strange. But barring anything completely out of the ordinary, I'll respond with something like, that sounds good, and then I'll continue to elicit the result behind that result. I'll say, I'm curious. What's important about that? And then they'll answer. And then I'll continue to dig. I'll say, I see. And I'm wondering what makes that important to you now, right? So rather than me sort of discuss it with you, I'd like to walk you through an example situation of eliciting the client's true values as a means of establishing a plan to get immediate results based on what it is they truly want, right? And while this is an example situation, I can assure you that this type of thing happens almost every single time. So we'll begin, right? You're on the phone with the client or Skype, or if you choose, in person. You say, what's the most important thing we can accomplish together over the next 90 days? Your client would maybe say, I want to add a sustainable and automated income stream of $30,000 a month to my bottom line, all right? So what do we say there? Do you remember? We continue to dig. We say, that sounds good. I'm curious. What's important about that? Now, I want you to notice something. I did two things. I said, that sounds good, indicating that I'm listening, right, and affirming that everything's cool with what they said. Then I'm softening the what's important about that question with the phrase, I'm curious. If you just keep saying what's important about that without softening it or using varying language, then they're going to get tired of you repeatedly asking the exact same question. But you can simply change it a little bit with the softening language. So, again, you say, that sounds good. I'm curious. What's important about that? Then your client may say, well, if I was making an extra $30,000 a month, I could hire some staff and then I could take some time off, right? So what do? Well, we keep on digging. So you say, I see. And you might even want to participate in active listening, like Thor discusses, right? You say, I see, yep. It sounds like you want to take some time off. Who doesn't, right? I think that's a very worthwhile endeavor. So I'm wondering, what makes taking time off important to you now, of all times? Right? Now, again, my primary question is what makes that important to you? But I'm softening it rather, with the phrase, and I'm wondering, and I'm also augmenting it with now, right? All of these are basically just to get me to not sound exactly the same. And I know it's very subtle, but it still works, right? So then they might respond with something like, well, I started this business so I could have more time with my family, but it seems like the bigger I get, I'm working more than ever. So I think if I had some staff members, I could delegate some work to them rather, and then I could free up my time. So bammo, now we're getting somewhere, right? We know that time with the family is a major value to this client, right? So if we wanted to, we could go from there and start devising ways to get this client more time, right, and get maximum results. Or you could continue to elicit more information from them if you want at this point. And I would recommend you do that. And the reason I would recommend you do it is because you can find potential solutions and scenarios this way. So really the only way I know how to explain this to you is to walk you through an example process using scenario building questions. So here we go. He has just said, hey, I started this business to have more time with my family, but the bigger I get, it seems I'm working more than ever, and I want some staff so I can take some time off, right? So that's where we left it. So then you might say, hey, look, that makes perfect sense. So let's talk about what these staff members might do so that you'd have more time off. Now you notice that I've bolded where I said so that you would have more time off. That's again just me giving you the example of active listening. So I'm repeating back to him what he said. And I know it might sound somewhat elementary or basic, but listen, it's really, really important that your client understands that you hear them. Largely, especially if you're dealing with a business owner, this person is in an environment all day where he probably feels like he's alone on an island surrounded by people that rarely listen to him, only carry out portions of the instructions given, and fail to understand the significance of any of his goals or hopes or dreams, right? As you know, as being an entrepreneur, it's a very lonely road. You know, you go home, in many cases, your spouse has no idea what it is you really do and has no interest in talking to you about your business. Your staff might not want to do what it is you want them to do. Your business isn't nearly as important to them as it is to you, etc. So it's really important that you do this active listening, that you truly understand what your client's values are. So that's why I've bolded that there. So now the client might say something like, well, the first thing that comes to mind is customer service. We're getting overwhelmed with questions from our customers, and I end up having to pick up the slack because I'm the most knowledgeable, right? So then you might answer with, well, tell me, what's happening there? And the client might say, well, we're getting lots of tech support questions about how to do X, Y, Z. And you might ask, how many are we talking about? And you know what? I mean, really to nitpick here, right? Where you say that, I would probably do a little more of the active listening. Say, oh man, a lot of tech support questions about how to do X, Y, Z. It sounds like that could be frustrating. How many are we talking about, right? Just to reaffirm what's going on. Then the client might say, probably 200 per day. Then you might say, wow, you know, that's a lot. And nobody else knows how to do this? And the client might say, not as well as I do. Right, so now we're beginning to understand a particular situation that's really troubling this person. Is this guy's running the whole show and he's getting hundreds of customer service emails a day, and he has to answer them because no one is as qualified as him to answer them, right? So we go on. You might say, I'm curious. Does it seem like it's always the same question? In this sense, the same question being asked by the customers. And the client might say, yes. And I explain how to do it in the user guide, but nobody reads it. Which, hey, I'm one of those people, right? And then you might say, I know what you mean. It seems like nobody reads the directions anymore. I'm wondering, is your answer almost always the same? Then the client might say something like, yeah, pretty much. And you might respond with, and I'm hearing you correctly that if you didn't, or rather, sorry, you might say, and am I hearing you correctly that if you didn't have to spend so much time answering this question over and over, you'd have more free time? Now again, listen, you know, I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, but I have found that this method of communication, when you really clarify and say things like, am I hearing you correctly that if X, Y, Z? And is that right? And am I correct? Or have I interpreted this properly? Or please let me repeat what I heard back to you to make sure I clearly understand. All of these types of phrases and statements are greatly appreciated by the customer or the client rather, in your case, and they really help make sure you truly do understand. Because listen, human beings, myself included, are horrible listeners typically, right? What is that statistic? We retain like 15% of whatever it is people say to us. So you really have to be careful here to make sure you hear properly. So again, I'll say, and am I hearing you correctly that if you didn't have to spend so much time answering this question over and over, you'd have more free time? And the client might say, yeah, it's really driving me crazy. So then you might say, I have an idea. Now, this is a great way to present a solution. Now, you got to understand, in a lot of cases, even though they're paying you money to help them, even though they're paying you to advise them and to help them move from point A to point B, many, many people are still very attached to their reasons and their stories as to why things are the way they are. And many times they're defensive about any role they might have played in the fact that things are the way they are. And they don't want to hear anything that could suggest it's possibly their fault or anything else. So it's very important that you be tactful when you begin presenting solutions, right? So now throughout this conversation, because I've been questioning and just constantly digging deeper and deeper, I found out this guy's freaking miserable because he's answering the same customer service question 200 times a day, right? And so obviously the solution is, dude, make an FAQ section or make a video or something, right? But we don't want to just say that, because who knows, maybe he made one that was so horribly written no one read it, and now he thinks that doesn't work or whatever. So you've got to present it properly. So you would in this case say, I have an idea. If there was a way to get you out of having to do this, and we could do it in a way that didn't cost you any money, would you be open to testing it? This is a great way to present any sort of desired action you want your client to take. If benefit, 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 minus bad thing, right? So we say, if there was a way to get you out of having to do this, that's benefit. And if we could do it in a way that didn't cost you any money, that's minus bad thing, right? Would you be open to testing it? So the formula is, I have an idea. If there was benefit minus bad thing, would you be open to testing it? I actually learned this phraseology from marriage and family therapists. I've worked with several of them. So that is some of the phraseology they use. Would you be open to exploring an idea to X, Y, Z? I think it's a great way to get people to start moving in a certain direction. So the client typically is going to say yes. You're like, why would they ever say no? Now, if they say no, you might have a real fruitcake on your hands. And if they do, you can say something, well, I'm curious. What about that causes resistance specifically? And any resistance you have is okay with me, but I'd like to understand better so I don't waste any of your time by steering you down a path you might not want to go to, right? And then they tell you, and then you could dig some more. But in this case, I'll assume they said yes, because 99.99% repeating of the time, they will say yes, right? So the guy said, yeah, sure. So now, this is where you begin to prescribe the course of action, right? Now, it's really, really important to understand something, that when you prescribe a course of action, it's really a big deal to do it in bite-sized chunks, right? Otherwise, you're going to totally overwhelm the client. And you have to understand that your area of expertise is your first language, and typically it is not their first language. So in this situation, if I were to say, oh, dude, okay, well, here's what you can do. You can make a tutorial video that walks on how to do that, and then do you have Infusionsoft? Because if you have Infusionsoft, you can get this plugin called Email to CRM, and it can, every time they email your support desk, if it sees any words that you might want to list in there that would indicate they're asking this question about this thing, it could then tag them in Infusionsoft, put them into a has question about XYZ list, and it can send them this automated response that now walks them through that tutorial video. But if they didn't have any of those keywords in their email, then the system would know to notify one of your tech support people. And if you started like going down that whole thing, it would overwhelm the client and freak them out, right? So it's important to do everything by baby steps. I've learned that the hard way, right? So that's how you do that. And listen, the reason I'm walking you through this, as basic as it may seem to some people, is for two reasons. Number one, consulting is very, very basic. A lot of people who are new think that they've got to get in with the client and give them 7 million ways to get the result they want. That's a surefire way to lose the client. your main skill set as a consultant, besides your bag of tricks, is, like I said earlier last week, it's being able to see the forest through the trees and having that 30,000-foot view, because they're too busy working in the business instead of on it, to use a very cliched phrase. So let me give you some real life examples of where some of these types of interesting things have happened. So example number one, it's one of my first clients, a guy who'd been a customer for years, right? Pretty cool guy. I say pretty cool. He's actually grouchy old man, but I like him because of that. And so he sold medical equipment, right? And he wanted more traffic. It was always his big thing ever since I've known him for like 10 years. More traffic, more traffic. Interesting thing was he hated spending money on advertising and claimed that nothing ever worked. So I had my work cut out for me, right? So his goal was to increase the inbound sales calls to his office, because it was a website that sold this medical equipment, and usually the customer had to call in and get some clarification and place the order. It wasn't like a shopping cart situation, because it was a fairly complex stuff. So after getting some questions, right, I found out, well, the reason he wants more traffic is because he wanted more calls. So this is interesting, because had I just stopped at I want more traffic, I could have immediately started prescribing courses of action to get more client or more traffic, right? Keyword analysis, expansion of media, etc., right? But I didn't. I said, well, what happens when they come to the page? What are we trying to increase? You know, because if you look at business, everything is usually a systematic machine, right? So a person clicks an ad, they go to a page, they take a desired action, that leads to the next desired action. So he said, well, I want more traffic because I want more phone calls. So I'm looking at the site, and had I not been in this digging mode, using the same thing I'm talking to you about, I would have started prescribing actions because, well, frankly, his website layout is unbelievably bad, and the damn phone number is like barely visible amidst the 900 million other things that they could do on the website. So I'd have fixed all of that, but I kept up with this framework of always find the true motive, right? So I found out after asking a million questions that the client was getting around 65 inbound sales calls per day. Now, this is a seven-figure business. So he's getting 65 inbound sales calls per day, but only 2 or 3 orders from those sales calls. So this means that if we could jump that orders daily from 2 or 3 up to 4 or 6, we would double the business revenue, right? So as an astute business person, where do you see our real focus should lie here? Not in more traffic, right? I mean, these people are they're clicking an ad, going to a website, picking up the phone, and calling them to buy something, and they're only closing 2 or 3. So obviously, we did not need to focus on any of this stuff. We needed to shift our focus to closing skills, fixing the hole in the bucket. All these people were calling trying to buy, but after careful analysis, we found out that the salespeople weren't even presenting them with the offer. They would just get them off the phone as quickly as possible and say, okay, I'm going to send you a quote by email, bye. And that was it, right? Can you believe that? So what we did is we shifted our focus on teaching the salespeople how to close, thus increasing revenue and never having to spend any more money on advertising and traffic, which for a very frugal client like this guy was and continues to be, that was a major win. So had I not asked those questions, we would have spent marketing dollars, gotten more traffic, and likely not gotten any more sales because we were, to use the metaphor, pouring water into a bucket with lots of holes in it. So that's example number one of a solution gained from asking these types of questions and doing the active listening. Let me give you another example. I have a client in the info marketing world. He's not in the internet marketing space. It's a different industry, right? Very big, very successful. And he wanted to sell more products. He has a huge staff, like lots of salespeople on hand, all these software applications, multiple companies. It's insane. Through questioning, I discovered that the business has very high volume, like millions and millions of dollars in volume. But his personal net, which is all I care about for my client, is how much the client keeps. Right? I don't care if they sell 10 million and the guy's taking home 800 grand. That sucks, right? Like, what if we could sell 1 million? He keeps it all. We've won. We've got a 20% increase in net take-home pay for the guy, right? So I discovered through questioning that the client is selling a lot of stuff, really high volume. He's not getting paid very much because his overhead is so high, and he's stressed out, working to death, and potentially setting himself up for a lot of product liability and regulatory scrutiny due to the nature of the industry he was in. Again, you probably wouldn't know this person. He's not in internet marketing. So anyway, who wants that? right? That doesn't sound like a good time. Plus, at the rate he was going, more sales ultimately meant more staff, more work with a minimal or at the very best disproportionate increase in net profits payable to him, the owner of the business, and the guy having to ultimately shoulder the burden of everything. And after going through the process I outlined with you, I discovered at the end of the day that this client really just wanted to stay home, sit on his porch, spend as much time with his wife and children, with a new child on the way, as possible, not have the big headaches, not have the big staff, and have minimal to zero exposure to liability. And what we discovered through more of the same process I just outlined with you was that his customers and his list just loved him. I mean, the guy was very, very popular with his crowd, and they thought he was awesome, and he does a great job, and they really just thought he was fantastic. And they desperately wanted personal help from him and to be able to interact with him. So as a result of that, instead of building out funnels to sell more of the products and growing the business that way, we actually chopped off major pieces of the business, eliminating massive headaches and expenses for the client, and we shifted his model to high-end consulting, similar, or actually not similar, exactly like what I'm showing you how to do, and we were able to reach the goal very, very quickly and also deploy other revenue streams, which were largely pure net profit and involved zero sales and zero liability whatsoever on his part. So those are two real-life examples of where the thing that they said they want was not really the thing they ultimately wanted, right? So if you were to take away something from this preliminary introduction to how to really take care of your clients and keep them happy, just know this. First of all, there's more to it than meets the eye with the client, right? And as a result of this, you always have to ask questions, never really take it at face value, and ultimately focus on the results of the results. So if the guy says, I want more money, we'll find out why specifically he wants more money. And as a result of that, finding out why and finding out what's important and finding out what the result will ultimately provide, you can usually find a shortcut to get them the ultimate true result even faster than the way they would have been able to get it if you would have just gone down the road without really clarifying and asking all of these questions. And in terms of finding the solutions to the problems they have, or finding the solutions or finding the pathway to getting them the results, typically you can always just rely on what's in your bag of tricks. Because ultimately, all your clients are going to have the same scenarios, right? I want more money, I need more time, whatever it may be. And you've got weaponry in your bag of tricks to help you do that. So if we were to go back and look at that very first example where the client said, hey, listen, I want to make $30,000 a month so I can have more time. Or ultimately it was, I want to make $30,000 a month so I can hire some staff so I can have more time. And then we decided, hey, man, well, you know, what if we just created a tutorial video that when people had questions, instead of you writing out the same answer 200 times, we could just direct them to this walkthrough video where you conduct the training personally to help them answer that question. So that's one thing, but then we could still simultaneously start building a system to help him make that $30,000 extra dollars, which would then just go to his bottom line and be payable to him instead of having to invest it in staff, right? So in that particular example, we would have a 2-4-1 win. So now let's talk about really how to keep up with this, right? Because you're going to know how to advise the client. You know, if, for example, in that scenario, I would then walk him through, okay, man, well, let's look at the answer you typically give to your clients and your customer service emails, this long drawn-out answer of how to do X, Y, Z, and now why don't we break that down into a very formulaic, well-written answer as a PDF, and also shoot them a tutorial video on how to do it, and I'd walk them through Camtasia, etc., or ScreenCam, or ScreenFlow, or whatever, and then I'd teach them how to have a canned auto response for anyone who had that question and so forth, and we would break that all down into missions for him to accomplish, right, between now and our next session. And whether we had him accomplish all of the missions or some of them would be really up to him and up to us. It's his speed, however fast he wants to go. And simultaneously, we would now have another mission of, okay, well, since we now have that problem solved, now let's talk about making the $30,000 extra dollars so you can keep it, you know, and then we would begin asking questions about his sales process. And we might find that we could do that with one-click upsells or the addition of continuity. So coming up with solutions for the client is relatively simple, as you've probably realized, because, like I said, they're almost always the same problem, potentially with a different wrapper around it, but it's usually something, in my case, more revenue, more leads, more sales, more back-end conversion or something. So the real trick to this is making sure that the client gets results, and that's where it becomes a little bit of a challenge, because not only do we have to tell them what to do, but we have to help them stay on track and do it. And that's where the client management aspect of this whole thing comes into play. So in the next video, I'm going to walk you through a few strategies to keep up with everybody and help keep them on track. Thankfully, all of this is relatively simple and low tech and won't really take very long to set up or deploy. So I'll end this video here, and I'll see you in the next one.